All right, welcome. Today, we are diving headfirst into one of the most ambitious and, let's be honest, controversial ideas in all of history, Plato's blueprint for a perfect society. It's a vision that is as brilliant as it is, well, terrifying. So let's get right into it. To really understand Plato's whole project, we have to start with a pretty shocking question. Why did one of the greatest minds ever think that democracy, the system so many of us value, was just a terrible idea? That question, right there, is the key that unlocks his entire political philosophy. So, here's the game plan. We're going to start with Plato's big problem with democracy. Then, we'll get into his core idea of justice. From there, we'll use his famous allegory of the cave to figure out who should rule. We'll actually build the ideal state, and then we'll look at the very controversial legacy of these ideas. Right? So you have to understand, Plato's philosophy wasn't dreamed up in some quiet, peaceful library. No, it was forged in the absolute fire of a political crisis. I mean, look at this timeline. Plato's life was basically bookended by disaster. He was born in what was supposed to be a golden age, but he grew up to watch Athens completely collapse. The city's brutal defeat in the war was a huge shock. But then, just 5 years later, the state executed his personal mentor, Socrates. These weren't just news headlines for him, they were the events that shaped his entire worldview. So his hatred of democracy really boiled down to two massive blows. First, he saw it as a political failure. He thought the chaos of democracy was the reason Athens lost the war. But second, and this one was personal, a democratic jury sentenced his hero, Socrates, to death. For Plato, that was the ultimate proof that the common person couldn't be trusted. They didn't just fail to recognize wisdom, they actively destroyed it. He came to believe that governing is a skill, a real expertise that most people just don't have. Okay, so if democracy is the problem, what's the solution? Well, Plato builds his entire perfect society on one single foundational idea, his very unique definition of justice. And for him, justice has nothing to do with courts or laws. It's all about natural order. This is it. This is the absolute cornerstone of the whole thing. For Plato, justice means harmony. It's this idea that a society works perfectly only when every single person is doing the one job that they are naturally best at. And, this part is key, they don't interfere with anyone else's job. It's all about specialization, order, and basically everyone staying in their own lane. And here's where it gets really clever. Plato connects the individual soul directly to the structure of society. He believed your soul has three parts: a rational part that loves truth, a spirited part that's all about honor and courage, and an appetitive part that just wants stuff. Food, money, you name it. So, he argued, the perfect state should perfectly mirror this. People dominated by reason, they become the rulers, the guardians. Those led by spirit, they're the warriors, the auxiliaries. And those driven by their appetites, they're the producers, the workers. A just state is just a scaled-up version of a well-balanced, just soul. Simple as that. So, if we're going to have a special ruling class, who gets to be in it? I mean, who is actually qualified to lead this whole perfect society? To answer that, Plato gives us one of the most famous stories in all of Western philosophy. Okay, so Plato says, imagine a group of people who have lived their entire lives chained up in a dark cave, forced to face a blank wall. Behind them is a fire, and all they ever see are the shadows of objects moving in front of that fire. For them, those shadows are reality. Now, what if one prisoner breaks free? He stumbles out of the cave into the blinding sunlight, and for the first time he sees the real world: trees, animals, the sun itself. He realizes the shadows were just pale imitations of the truth. This guy, the escaped prisoner, he's the philosopher. But here's the tragic part. When he goes back into the cave to try and free the others, they don't believe him. They think he's crazy and even try to kill him because he's threatening their comfortable reality. And that story leads us right to Plato's most famous and most radical conclusion. The only person fit to rule is the one who escaped the cave, the philosopher. Only the people who have seen the sunlight of true knowledge are qualified to lead. Why? Because everyone else, from Plato's perspective, is still chained up, just staring at shadows on the wall. Okay, so we've got our ruler, the philosopher-king. Now what? What does the society they rule over actually look like? What are the rules of the house in Plato's perfect world? Well, the basic structure is pretty clear. At the top, you have the philosopher-king, who rules based on pure reason. The whole of society is then rigidly divided into those three classes we talked about. But, and you have to get this, here's where Plato is thousands of years ahead of his time. He argued for total equality between men and women. In his state, women would get the exact same education and have the exact same opportunities to become rulers or warriors. It was all based on their natural talent, not their gender. Pretty wild for ancient Greece. But Plato wasn't even close to done. He looked around and saw what he thought were the two biggest sources of corruption for any leader: wanting personal wealth and loyalty to your own family. His solution to this was probably the most shocking and controversial thing he ever came up with. Now, when I say the word communism, you're probably thinking of Karl Marx, right? Well, you gotta get that out of your head. Plato's version was totally different. First, it didn't apply to everybody, only to the top two classes, the rulers and the warriors. And second, the goal was completely different. He wasn't trying to create economic equality for all. He was trying to surgically remove greed and favoritism from the people in charge. He wanted to destroy the very idea of mine versus yours for the leaders. So get this, the rulers would own nothing. No private homes, no money beyond their basic needs. And here's the real kicker: no traditional families. Children would be taken from their parents right after birth and raised together by the state. No one would know who their biological parents or children were. The whole point was to make sure a ruler's only loyalty was to the state, and not to their own bank account or their own kids. As you can probably guess, these ideas didn't exactly get a round of applause from everyone. For more than 2,000 years, Plato's perfect world has been torn apart and fiercely debated. Many people look at his blueprint and don't see a utopia. They see the design for an absolute nightmare. And maybe the most powerful attack came from Plato's own best student, Aristotle. He thought the whole idea of abolishing the family was a disaster waiting to happen, and he summed it up with this brilliant line: "A child of everyone will be a child of no one." His point is pretty simple and powerful. If everyone is responsible for a child, then in the end, no one is. And the criticisms go way deeper. For starters, his entire system is built on this three-part soul idea, which, modern science doesn't support at all. Then there are the really dark parts. He actually advocated for eugenics, suggesting that infants born with disabilities should be left to die. And in the 20th century, thinkers like Karl Popper made the famous argument that Plato's Republic isn't a guide to a better world, but a terrifyingly detailed blueprint for a totalitarian state. And yet, the idea just won't die. The ideal of a perfectly wise, enlightened leader who is above politics, it still persists. Some people today even see echoes of the philosopher-king in modern world, like in the role of Iran's supreme leader, a position that's designed to be guided by superior moral and religious knowledge. So whether it's a noble dream or a dangerous fantasy, Plato's vision is still very much with us. Which brings us to one last, really unsettling question. Plato tried to engineer a perfect society, one built on pure logic, completely free from human messiness and corruption. But in stripping away all the things that make us messy, our property, our families, our choices, did he design a utopia? Or did he just give us the blueprint for a world that is perfectly logical, but also fundamentally inhuman?